When you look at the viruses that we obviously have a history in coming overseas and impacting the United States, we need to remember as well that China controls 80% of the supply of our prescription drug ingredients as well. So not only do they outsource their viruses to the United States, then they also control the ingredients and the drugs that we need to take care of Americans here today when they do get sick.
And the South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem with me last week on this program with some disturbing commentary. Communist China still controlling America's supply of medicine. 4 years after the outbreak of COVID-19 from a lab in Wuhan that has killed more than 1.1 million Americans so far, the CCP has yet to provide evidence on how that deadly virus originated and explain its cover-up that followed. Next month, Dr. Anthony Fauci is set to testify for 2 days before the House on the origins of COVID-19 and his handling of the pandemic, where Republicans are expected to grill him on overseeing funding of gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab, as well as discrediting the theory the virus originated from a lab leak. Joining me right now is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. He is vowing to hold hearings on the origins of COVID in the upper chamber if Republicans retake control next year. Senator Paul is also the author of the new book, Deception: The Great COVID Cover-Up, available right now. Senator, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Maria.
Well, you've been an incredible truth teller throughout all of this, and you've studied all of this now for several years. What can you tell us about what you've learned, what you've taken away from the entire COVID experience?
Well, you know, the problem is that the Chinese have destroyed any kind of reputation they had. I mean, we can no longer believe any kind of pronouncements from them, which makes us suspicious. You know, right now there's a host of disease affecting young people, respiratory disease and pneumonia in China. And they tell us, well, there's nothing to see here. And maybe that's true, but they've destroyed any kind of foundation we had in trusting them, and they still haven't come clean. You know, in early 2020, when COVID came out, they said, oh, we're not having human-to-human transmission, and we don't seem to be having an extraordinary amount of flooding of the hospitals or deaths. All of that was untrue, and they knew for at least 3 or 4 weeks. They also knew the sequence of the virus, and they kept that secret as well. I think they also knew that 3 of their workers got sick at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in November 2019. I think they knew all of this, and I think they absolutely know it now. And the only way they can restore trust is to own up to it. Look, I don't blame them completely for this. I think it was an accident, but a cover-up is not an accident. If they were to come clean and say, you know, we're punishing the scientists who did what they weren't supposed to, I think then that we could restore some trust. But right now we have really no trust with the Chinese government.
Well, what about the accountability here and why the Biden administration does not push for it? I mean, right now, as we speak, there are American investors continuing to underwrite the CCP by buying those companies that are tied to the Chinese military. It seems this administration is not willing to pull the economic lever, and that is shut off the capital markets to Chinese communist companies that may have been involved in that cover-up or tied to the military.
Well, we still continue to fight the Biden administration every day just for unclassified information, and they resist at every turn. We've had to basically withhold nominees and withhold legislation to try to get anything from the Biden administration. And I'm not sure what it is. Either it's sympathy or believing that relations with China are so important that the truth can be obscured. But there's also a certain amount of culpability in the Biden administration throughout several different departments, USAID, NIH, HHS. They're withholding documents because they funded the lab in Wuhan, not just once, not just twice, but for a decade they were funding. And we have Anthony Fauci on record as saying that even if a pandemic occurs, even if a gain-of-function research infects a scientist and a pandemic occurs, that the knowledge would be worth the risk. And I think most people who had a loved one die, you know, from COVID, either here or around the world, would disagree and think Anthony Fauci made a disastrous judgment call. But he also took the research and it didn't go before the normal scrutiny. There's a safety committee that was supposed to review this, and Anthony Fauci allowed this research to be done at his signature, at his conclusion, at his approval, without the approval of the safety committee. And this, for this, he really should go down in history, perhaps as one of the worst people in public office ever, and responsible for probably more deaths than any other individual in the medical world.
Well, I mean, there was so much censorship of so much information that was vital for Americans to see and understand about COVID and about the vaccines, but they censored it. Can we even trust health officials in this government?
Well, you know, it was directed explicitly by him. We go over this in the book because he commissioned scientists who were saying in private that they thought it was a manipulated virus, manipulated in a lab and came from a lab. He convinced them in public to say the opposite. He commissioned and edited a paper that said that absolutely this did not come from a lab, while privately all of these same scientists were saying in all likelihood it did come from a lab. So there really was an orchestrated cover-up on this. We also now know that he was visiting the CIA in early 2020. We know that the CIA scientists, 7 of them, voted 6-1 to say it came from the lab, and then they were reversed by superiors. We need to know whether Anthony Fauci influenced the superiors or perhaps the opposite. Did the CIA influence Anthony Fauci? But we also need to know how often he was visiting and what he was there for. Our understanding is that he wasn't recorded on visitor logs, but he was appearing frequently at the CIA. You have to realize that he was not a scientist in charge of a cure for cancer. He was also in charge of a lot of bioweapons money and in charge of a lot of things that had dual use. And they won't reveal any of this to us. They had weekly meetings on dangerous dual-use research concerns and gain of function, and not one item of any of those meetings has been released to us, despite us asking for it for over 3 years.
Do you believe COVID was a bioweapon?
I think that it was probably developed for a vaccine. I think they developed coronavirus. They inserted this cleavage site in to make it more infectious to humans. And then they had a vaccine very early on because I think they were developing a vaccine against COVID, and then COVID got out. But the interesting thing is the scientist, Dr. Zoe Yusin, who developed it, died mysteriously 2 months after the development of the virus. He fell from a tall building in Beijing. And there's a lot of questions as to the circumstances of his death.
Wow. Well, I did not realize that he died from a tall building in Beijing. That's incredible. Let me switch gears, ask you about the supplemental package. You all are leaving for the holidays next week, but you're right now debating this $100 billion supplemental package that Joe Biden wants, money sent to Ukraine, if you're going to send money to Israel. And the Republicans so far have dug in, saying we want policy changes at the border. Where is this going?
You know, we don't have the money, and the biggest threat, while I agree the border should be secured, an even bigger threat is to the dollar and to our currency. I follow Jim Grant. I think he's one of the smartest guys out there, you know, looking at the economy and the Fed. He predicted a lot of the things that happened in 2008 when we had the housing bubble burst. He thinks we're due for interest rates, high interest rates for a long period of time, but we're accumulating debt at $1 trillion every 3 months now. This is an extraordinary thing, and interest rates are now becoming the highest or one of the largest items in our budget. So really, people can talk about wanting to help other countries. We don't have the money. It has to be printed up. It's destroying our currency, and it's why it costs more to go to the grocery store to buy your groceries. We can't allow this to happen. There is a possibility we could go too far with this, and we could have a cataclysmic economic downturn, recession, depression, destruction of the currency. I know that sounds over the top, but that's what I'm worried about because we're accumulating debt so fast.
Well, I agree with you about Jim Grant. Jim Grant is a regular of mine on Mornings with Maria over on the Fox Business Network, and he's been sounding the alarm about all of this debt for a long time. But you've got a package at hand, and you've got a vote on this coming up. Where is this going? Are you guys going to go to the holiday and not send any money to Ukraine? What do you expect this to happen? How does this play out, rather? Pardon me.
You know, my hope is that Speaker Johnson will stick to his word. He said Israel aid would be separate and paid for. He immediately voted for it, and the House passed it, and they paid for it by taking money away from the IRS. I hope he stands by his word. I think he has an enormous leverage if he'll use it. Now, he's getting pushed by all the establishment Republicans, particularly on the Senate side. He's being pushed to put all the aid together with Ukraine. I think if he keeps it separate and keeps it paid for, I think that he'll win the day ultimately. But he needs to realize he has all the power if he'll stay where he is and not capitulate.
All right, Senator, we'll be watching all of that. Thank you again for being a truth teller in all of these health issues. We appreciate your time this morning, sir. Thank you. Senator Rand Paul joining us.